And joining us now in the studio, Rebecca MacKinnon, author of Consent of the Networked, the Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom. Hello again.
Great to be here.
Okay, so yesterday we talked about the role of governments and the issue of internet freedom. Today I want to focus on the technology companies and the role they have. You call companies like Facebook and Google the sovereigns of cyberspace. Why'd you give them that term?
Because they are exercising a kind of sovereignty over our lives. Now, it's different than physical government sovereignty. They're not taxing us. They're not putting us in jail when we break the law and that kind of thing. But they are setting rules that shape what we can and cannot do online. So with Facebook, for instance, they have a whole set of rules about, your identity, for instance. And part of their terms of service is that you have to use your real name. And while there are some people who go on Facebook with fake names, if you're an activist or if you're a heavy Facebook user and you're very public and you're trying to promote a cause and you're trying to call attention to things or you're trying to organize things, most likely you're going to be flagged or reported for terms of service violation if you're not actually using your real identity. And then you can get your account deactivated.
How?
So, well, this happens all the time. So one really prominent example was actually a group of Egyptian activists who were using Facebook under fake names. And there was a very troubling case in the summer of 2010 where a young man was beaten to death by police because he was uploading some video onto YouTube of some police malfeasance. His name is Khaled Saeed. And so some young activists using fake names set up a Facebook page called We Are All Khaled Saeed to try and draw attention to this problem of police brutality in Egypt. And they were organizing protests and bringing people into the streets. And then in November 2010, it was actually Thanksgiving in the United States. The night before a huge protest that they were planning, and they were using this page to organize a protest, the page went away. It was deactivated. Why? Because somebody had reported them for terms of service violation for not using their real names. And some human rights groups ended up contacting Facebook and negotiating a deal where they kind of transfer ownership of this page to an Egyptian person in the United States who was using her real name. But this is one example of how this rule can affect activism in ways that are not always particularly positive. And this is part of the real name rule is part of Mark Zuckerberg's ideology, really.
Right.
I mean, he has said that he thinks that people who go online without using their real name lack integrity. And he does have a point that there are a lot of people who go online with fake names or anonymously and say really nasty things to people, and that there are a lot of bullies and others who hide behind pseudonymity or anonymity. But at the same time, there are others who really aren't safe if they have to use their real name. So Facebook has created this rule. It's sort of the law of Facebookistan. And you're only able to exist within Facebookistan in a stable manner if you're complying with the rules. And also just kind of in terms of how Facebook manages your identity. Again, what is public, what is not, what is shared, what is not, how, in what ways other people interact with you, or how people kind of can see you or not as a person. That's very much shaped by the way in which the platform is organized and programmed. And so as we're all becoming increasingly dependent on Facebook, for our politics, to find out information, to connect with all our friends, it's shaping the nature of our offline lives in a lot of different ways, and in some ways that are very positive, but in other ways that have implications that we are very far from really understanding.
I like the term Facebookistan. Is that your term?
I think it is, yeah.
It's a good one.
I believe I made it up.
You should patent it. You write about also this concept of software code as law. So why is it important for us to understand that and the political influence of technology companies?
Yeah, well, here I'm building on a concept by a very distinguished law professor named Lawrence Lessig, who wrote a book over a decade ago called Code, in which he declared code is law. And what it means is as follows. You know, you have legal code, which of course, you know, is passed by legislatures that says this is what you're allowed to do and this is what you're not allowed to do. But software code also shapes what you can and cannot do digitally. You know, just what you can access, what you can't access, et cetera. And so that's a kind of soft law. And it's being exercised by businesses that are not directly accountable to the public in any way. Now, I'm not saying that we should nationalize all businesses and that anything Facebook or Google does needs to be held to some kind of worldwide vote or something. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that it is just a reality, given the nature of these businesses and given how dependent we are on these businesses for all aspects of our lives and how we understand the world and how we interact with the world. And there's a political component to that, and there are political implications to that, and there are implications for our civil liberties, and implications for how and when and whether we can exercise our rights, and also implications for how governments manipulate our world or access information about us, and so on. And that's just a reality, and companies, I argue, have a social responsibility to contribute to an internet that is compatible with human rights and civil liberties, just as other types of companies have an obligation not to render our air completely unbreathable and our water undrinkable, to be environmentally responsible, to be responsible in their labor practices, not to hire 12-year-olds and to abuse working hours and abuse people's health. You know, there's been, in terms of the labor movement, a century-long or more movement to get companies to recognize they have a social license to operate in terms of how they treat the labor force. And there's been, half century of an environmental movement that's gotten companies to recognize, not in any kind of perfect way, but we're a lot farther than we were in the 1950s in terms of recognizing that having a sustainable business, a business that's contributing positively, or at least less negatively, towards the environment, towards the communities that they operate in, is in the long run in their commercial interest. Even though in the short run, maybe, okay, you might maximize your profits by completely ignoring all of these social environmental costs. In the long run, that's not a sustainable business approach. And so my argument in the book is that companies also need to start thinking sustainably about what they need to do to ensure that the internet evolves in a way that is compatible with our civil liberties, that is compatible with our rights, compatible with the kind of society that, here in North America, we're kind of constantly struggling to maintain, and that people are risking their lives around the world to achieve.
Corporate responsibility.
Corporate responsibility.
Okay, one company that's always talked about, and I want to talk a little bit about it, is Apple, of course. And in 1984, this advertisement, Apple ran an ad that became, the hallmark of all ads. So let's just take a little bit of a look at that.
One resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
I think that ad was ran during the Super Bowl or something back in
That's right.
84, directed by Ridley Scott. Anyway, the ad itself implies that technology and companies like Apple would set us all free. So fast forward 8 years later, has Apple really stuck to that mission statement?
Well, you know, Apple's a very controversial company, and they have not. I mean, in the context of that ad, it was, I think Steve Jobs' vision was that Apple was going to set people free from the tyranny of Microsoft, was sort of the framing, and Microsoft and IBM. But the problem is that they've sort of, as with many revolutions, created a new dictatorship. You know, sort of like what happened with the Russian Revolution that was supposed to set everybody free. And so what you have with Apple is a very closed system. And a very authoritarian system of deciding what people can and cannot do with the technology, what they can access. And so, for instance, with the apps that you get on your iPad or your iPhone, Apple has a very kind of opaque and closed system for deciding what gets approved. And they comply with censorship requirements in different countries. So in China, the Chinese App Store for iPads and iPhones that are bought in China, politically controversial material is censored from those app stores. So the Dalai Lama app is not accessible there, et cetera, et cetera. But even when it comes to things that are constitutionally protected in the United States, that are very much within the protected realm of speech in North America and Western Europe, you see things getting censored. So for instance, an American political cartoonist named Mark Fiore submitted this app that was just full of kind of the greatest hits of his cartoons, making fun of all kinds of politicians, including President Obama. And the app was refused. It was rejected for being too controversial.
Rejected by whom?
By employees at Apple, kind of based on their criteria. And they eventually reconsidered it after he got a Pulitzer Prize. But the speech that he was engaging in was not the kind of speech that would remotely be considered, inflammatory. It's not the kind of thing where it's like, let's call on people to, kill somebody. The type of speech that might potentially be legally problematic within the First Amendment. It was very, very clearly First Amendment protected speech in the United States. Absolutely no question. That this guy had a right to publish this material. Yet Apple was applying a much more constrained set of criteria that actually is much more narrow than the First Amendment. And there's a number of other examples of independent filmmakers just doing kind of troubling and controversial films who have tried to get their apps approved and seen them rejected. Again, because Apple's employees are concerned about offending certain constituencies.
So it's not pressure from the government?
Not in that case, no. There have been issues with some other companies, for instance, with Amazon. Amazon was hosting WikiLeaks for a little while at the time that WikiLeaks published its controversial cables. And no charges were brought against WikiLeaks. No case was made that WikiLeaks itself had committed a crime. Separate from Bradley Manning,
right,
the guy who obtained the cables. But WikiLeaks, as a publisher of the cables, no case has been brought, let alone judgment made or anything else. Yet Amazon dropped WikiLeaks as a customer just because a range of American politicians were saying that it should. And that's very controversial.
Well, authoritarian regimes also pressure companies in a different way to censor or release user data. And you write about the example of Yahoo in China. Tell me about that example.
Yeah. So in China, Yahoo went into China in the late 90s. It was one of the first American internet companies to set up web services. And they went in with not only their search engine, but an email service and so on. And so there's this case of a Chinese journalist named Shi Tao, and he used Yahoo China email. It's like yahoo.cn. It was hosted on computer servers inside China. He used his Yahoo China email account to send a story to a New York-based Chinese website that's kind of an exiled dissident website about a crackdown that was about to go on that he had gotten word of kind of internally through the newspaper he was working for. So he was reporting on sort of government plans to censor and control information in the run-up to the June 4th anniversary, the anniversary of the June 4th crackdown, and how the government's plan to control information and prevent people from talking about this publicly. So he wrote an article about what the government's plans were, and he ended up getting arrested, put in jail, and sentenced to 10 years. And Yahoo responded to a Chinese police request to hand over the account information. The account didn't have his name on it. And so they only could verify that the account came from him if Yahoo handed over the information, which they did. And so the case was made. And there are several other people in China as well who went to jail, in part based on information handed over by Yahoo to the Chinese police. So it was an issue of, Yahoo went into China without having thought through the implications of what does it mean when we're running an email service inside China and you're in a country that defines crime to include political and religious activity. You're inevitably going to end up collaborating with human rights violations. And because of what happened with Yahoo, actually Microsoft and Google, though they did go into China, they never went in with email services because they didn't want to have to be in that position.
I guess the pushback, though, Rebecca, is that, if we look at internet companies as private owners who have the right to decide who can or cannot occupy space and under what terms, versus looking at them as sort of, public spaces, the National Mall in DC, for example. I mean, isn't that a fair assessment that these companies should be able to have more freedom in what they do and who they allow and the rules by which people enter into agreements with them than government should?
I mean, there's definitely, yes. I mean, they are private spaces. They're not public spaces. And I think, they're shopping malls. They're not, public squares. But at the same time, if you have a situation where, in digital space, pretty much everything is a shopping mall, then that's an issue for public discourse, particularly in countries where meeting publicly in physical space is very difficult to do. So they are having, again, it's kind of this balance between, yes, you are a private company, and no, you're not Human Rights Watch, but at the same time, you're having an impact on people's lives. And there's a responsibility to consider what you're doing and how. Part of it has to do with transparency, making sure that your users understand what's being collected about them, what they're giving up when they sign up for your service, how their data is being shared, with whom, under what circumstances. We can't ask Shu Tao what he knew, but it's quite likely that he thought that because he was using an American branded email service that his data was more secure from Chinese police than a Chinese email service. Turns out, actually, there was no difference. But did he understand that? People need to be properly informed so that they can make informed choices about how they're going to use a service. And the problem is that people are not clearly informed. And you're starting to see more pushback, and as people become more aware of these issues, some companies are responding to this. And so, for instance, Google, has started to release something it calls a transparency report, where it actually reports on the number of requests it gets from all the governments and all the countries where it operates in, both for user information and to take down information, so that the public will actually be more aware of what's going on. And there are other activists, sort of internet rights activists, that are calling for this type of transparency by all internet companies as a condition. There's also, I'm involved with something called the Global Network Initiative, which recognizes, yes, businesses are businesses, They're not non-governmental organizations. They're not public services. Yet at the same time, businesses have an impact on our civil liberties and our human rights, and it's actually well established in other sectors like the oil and gas and mining sectors and other much more traditional industries that they have human rights obligations along with their obligations to their shareholders, and that those need to be recognized. And so we're actually in the context of this organization called the Global Network Initiative that I'm involved with, where companies that join commit to uphold basic standards on free expression and privacy, and none of them are doing perfectly, but we're asking them to do what we call human rights due diligence on their products every time they go into a new market, just to think through, okay, if I do this service in this way, what is it going to mean from a human rights standpoint? Kind of like companies for a lot of years now have been doing environmental impact assessments and are actually required to by a lot of governments. So there's this new concept of human rights impact assessments as well.
It is interesting that you draw the parallel that these companies should act more like the oil and gas industry and follow regulations like that. I mean, it's an interesting connection
that you made.
Yeah, it's ironic,
isn't it? That actually, if you talk to at least some companies in the oil and gas and mining sectors, that actually a lot of them have been joining initiatives where they agree to adhere to certain standards when it comes to both revenue transparency with authoritarian governments and not to cooperate with militias that are going to abuse people's rights when they're trying to secure their facilities. And there's a recognition that they have human rights obligations. And ironically, a lot of telecommunications, internet, high-tech companies are much more reluctant to come out and say, yeah, we have human rights obligations. For some reason, I think in part because they're newer companies, or in part because they're like, oh, well, we're the internet. We are human rights, so therefore, what are you going on about?
You, in your book, you make this large argument that we should upgrade, I think, from a Hobbesian approach of digital governance to a more Lockean model. And we're obviously not talking about the cartoon strip, we're talking about philosophers. So explain to me what you mean by this.
Sure. So, this all kind of comes down again to consent of the governed, right? And there was a time, in our physical space where the notion was that the sovereign, was kind of acting in the interests, and Hobbes, the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes kind of made this argument that, you have the state of nature, and that you need a sovereign to come in and protect people, and that people give up certain rights in order to receive security and other benefits. And Hobbes was more of a monarchist, where he was kind of using this theory to justify strong centralized government. And then other philosophers like Locke came along and kind of pushed this notion of consent of the governed, and that, no, we don't want a state of nature, we don't want chaos and anarchy, that in order for people to exercise their rights and have freedoms, you actually do need some governance to go on. At the same time, this governance needs to happen, it needs to be grounded in consent of the governed. And if it's not, then it's not legitimate. And so my argument is that companies, because they're exercising a kind of governance, again, it's not the exact same kind of governance that physical governments exercise, but it's still a kind of governance, that if they want to be legitimate in the long run, and if they want to be successful in the long run, they need our trust. And if they're going to get our trust, they need to ground their rules and their processes in some form of consent, some ability to gauge that they are proceeding in a way that is respectful of people's rights, that is taking people's concerns into account. And I'm not saying that, Facebook should hold everything to a vote of all its users, but I am saying they need to engage more directly and take the concerns of their users more seriously, and incorporate those concerns into how they develop their platform if they want people to trust them.
We've talked about what governments, you argue, should do, what technology companies should do. What can I as an individual do to make sure that the rights that we have in physical spaces of democracy actually transpire online?
Well, I think a lot of it is just about being informed and involved, right? And so politically, as a voter, you might be voting based on all kinds of different criteria. Include internet rights in your criteria for voting for your representatives, and so on. Just to ask, does this person have a record of supporting online civil liberties or not? Use your power. Support causes that are pushing for policies that are seeking the right kind of balance between, these things we need like security and services and so on the one hand, but making sure that civil liberties remain a core protected value. Support those types of policies, support groups that are working on those types of policies. As a user of technology and a consumer, start thinking more about, is this particular device or this particular internet service provider, what is their record in terms of protecting my information? And to the extent you have choice, make your choices based on this company's record of respecting people's free expression and privacy. As an investor, some socially responsible investment is a rapidly growing segment of the investment space. More and more people are putting their retirement money into socially responsible investment funds. And a growing number of those funds are including free expression and privacy, and internet rights as part of their criteria. And so you can seek out as an investor and sort of push for, don't put your money into companies that are doing the wrong thing or that don't share your values.
I await the day when the next politician or wannabe politician knocks on my door and I can ask them about their views on internet freedom. It's certainly become more of a marriage between politics and internet freedom. Rebecca MacKinnon, this is a really fascinating book. Introduced me to a world that I knew very little about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.